thank you everyone for coming to this session. This is the workshop for the third working group of the coalition, working group on privacy and transparency. We have quite a few of the members of our group in the room, so we'll give a few opening remarks to describe our scope and our work to date and our objectives, and then we'd really like this workshop to be as interactive as possible. We're looking for your ideas of useful activities this group could take up. We'd love to learn more about what you do and how we could complement existing efforts in the field. So after a few remarks, we'll just open it for questions. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the working groups generally, they're multi-stakeholder groups that were established under the auspices of the FOC as a way to work on concrete policy issues in an ongoing way between the FOC conferences and other events. Our working group is dedicated to promoting and protecting human rights in the relationship between governments and companies. And specifically in this first phase of work, we've focused on transparency about government requests for companies for user information or content restriction in the context of national security and law enforcement. So we'll talk a bit about why we took that focus, how it fits into the broader coalition's agenda, and why transparency matters and is an area that we've chosen to take up. For those of you who don't have a copy, we do have copies of a draft executive summary of a report that we're working on right now and we'll be publishing this summer. So please pick up a copy or look at it at the FOC website, and it will also give you more detail about our scope. So, Stephen, do you want to?
I should begin by saying you have been listening to Catherine Kendrick, who's the co-chair, and I'm the other co-chair. And I wanted to start by thanking members of the working group, and particularly Catherine and Charles, who worked tirelessly to get the report here for today. The genesis of this coming out of Tunis and then out of Tallinn, and the development of work streams through the Freedom Online Coalition was the increasing expectation of work around privacy and transparency and the interest in this area, and also very much rooted in the business and human rights world and the UN guiding principles on business and human rights adopted in 2011. And that very much governs the relationship between government and the private sector generally, but in particular for our work in the ICT field. And you find an awful lot of work in this area, or in the absence of regulation in many areas. There's a lot of emphasis or onus put onto individual companies to make decisions. You only have to look at the right to be forgotten and the way that companies have to make decisions about how they handle data and data requests. And the framework of business and human rights and the guiding principles is about the company's responsibility to respect human rights. But from the government's point of view, it's the obligation we have to assist the private sector and work with the private sector to fulfill that responsibility. So this is very much looking at how that relationship works, and the Tallinn recommendations called on governments to operate in with transparency and effective oversight, and for others to do the same. I think the growing expectation that in this field there would be more transparency is kind of the key behind this. So I think people understand that there will be a relationship between governments and the private sector relating to data, but where the biggest concerns have arisen is where there's been a lack of transparency and a lack of understanding about how that relationship works. I think a lot of companies are ahead of government on this, and we'll hear from one. But I think it's important that governments work closely together and with private companies to set out the expectations that we have of companies, and so that individuals can understand how that relationship works, and where requests are made between governments and companies, not necessarily details obviously, but what's the framework that governs that relationship, and how does that operate in order to promote freedom of expression and a human rights agenda? Thank you.
Great, thanks, Stephen. Ben, do you want to talk about your perspective from Google on these issues?
Perfect. Sorry, my name is Ben Blink. I'm on the International Relations Public Policy team at Google. My specific focus is issues of freedom of expression. To give you a little bit of context about transparency from the corporate point of view, about 5 years ago, people at Google realized that many of our users were asking lots of questions about the ways in which companies and governments interacted in relation to government requests, specifically about requests for their user data, their communications, and other information that we store, and about the information that governments demand be removed from our platforms, things like YouTube, Blogger, and other platforms that we own. And we had long had legal process in place for receiving these types of requests, and for evaluating and pushing back when they were too broad and other things. But users, for the most part, had no insight into what the scale and the scope was of the requests we were getting, and whether or not that might be impacting their communications or the ways in which they interact with the web. So we would field individual questions from activists in places around the globe saying, are you giving my data to government? Because I can't trust using your service if you're doing that. So the solution we came up with at the time was to release what we call the Transparency Report, an interactive website where users can look at specific data, one about requests that governments make to get their user data, and the second that governments make to remove content or to censor information. The report's at google.com/transparencyreport. And we decided to release new data every 6 months and to keep the report updated and to continue to evolve it as much as we possibly could. Now, the thing about transparency that's really excellent is the more data and information we release, the more questions people ask, which is good, both about how we process these types of requests and about what governments are actually doing. So the reports have been very helpful for us. One, because it really raised the awareness of many people in civil society about the scope of these types of, and the scale of these requests, but it also rooted them in concrete information about how it interacted with Google. It wasn't conspiracy theories, it wasn't big ideas, it was specifically the data that was laid out. Now, at the time when this was released, there were specific laws in certain places that prohibited us, notably the US, from releasing data about or even acknowledging national security requests. I think as Google and other companies in civil society have pushed back on the US specifically, requesting that we're able to release more data, our transparency report was a very useful tool in that advocacy. We could say that our users want to see this information in the transparency report. They're demanding this type of information. And ultimately we were able to make that agreement, and we can say that the entire scope of the requests that we get from the US government and other governments are in our transparency report. And we've just been able to update that continually since. So I think right now we have transparency reports from many companies that have released these reports giving insight. I think the next step, again, as was mentioned earlier, is to think about how governments can actually proactively give this information. Because when a user looks at a Google transparency report, the only thing they're seeing is from one company, one service they're possibly using. I know it's complex for governments, but the idea that a citizen could go to one website and have a much better sense of what laws impacted their personal data, what requests were going out to companies, I think would be a huge advance in online freedom, and something we've discussed thoroughly as part of this working group.
Thanks, Ben. Emma, do you want to talk a bit about our approach?
Sure. Hi, I'm Emma Alonso. I'm the director of the Free Expression Project at the Center for Democracy and Technology. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how we approached the work of this working group. And I think for a little bit of context, in the 2 years since the revelations from Edward Snowden about government surveillance, particularly by the United States, but a number of other governments around the world, there's been a lot of debate around the substance of surveillance law, national security law. There's a lot of debate that's still ongoing about specifics of how would you reform surveillance and intelligence agencies access to user information. But one kind of quickly emerging bit of consensus in the wake of those revelations was the topic of transparency. That seemed to be the one thing that governments and companies and civil society could all sort of come to, that more transparency around these frameworks, whatever they are, these laws and policies and practices, was really important, was something that all stakeholders should work toward. We saw the acknowledgement in the Tallinn agenda of the FOC governments last year, this real commitment to transparency. And the work of the working group was able to start really digging into not just kind of discussing the need for transparency, but what really are the challenges and opportunities for increasing transparency on behalf of governments and on behalf of companies. And so we developed a series of questions that we used in consultation with a number of governments and a number of companies. Conducted these consultations one-on-one, one company or government at a time with members of the working group under Chatham House rules, so that we really felt that this would enable the conversations to be as kind of wide-ranging and searching and kind of blunt as possible at times, because we would not be associating particular kind of information about how this company or that government addresses very specific questions. So I think the list of the governments and companies that we discussed is in the executive summary, but the governments included Australia, Estonia, Mongolia, the Netherlands, Sweden, the United Kingdom, and the United States. And the companies we spoke with included Cloudflare, Facebook, Google, LinkedIn, Mozilla, Orange, TeliaSonera, and Vodafone. So on the company side, a mix of internet companies and telecommunications companies. And we were able to use these consultations to really sort of dig into what are the challenges that either of these two institutions, governments or companies, face in trying to pull together the information for a transparency report. And I think a little bit later we'll talk about some of the specific findings that we had. But just from my perspective, it was really enlightening to have such kind of in-depth conversations with the people that we consulted with about kind of their approach, their institutional commitment to doing transparency, and how important that was to actually getting from kind of a general interest in transparency reporting to an actual produced report, and understanding a lot of the challenges sort of were similar across companies and governments. If you're thinking particularly of large multinational corporations, have many of the same sort of logistical and coordination challenges that governments with multiple departments and agencies involved in making these sorts of requests might have. So I think we'll be discussing more of these findings later, but that's just to give you a sense of how we came up with some of the information and recommendations in the report.
Great, thanks, Emma. And Rebecca, do you want to wrap us up?
So I think my role in this panel is to talk more broadly about the work that this working group is building on, that this study sort of wasn't immaculately conceived coming out of nowhere, but it's really building on the work of a number of organizations and projects and researchers over the past decade and more. To just name a few, I mean, we heard about the UN Guiding Principles, which I think really provides the framework for this. Governments have the primary duty to protect human rights, and companies have the responsibility to respect human rights. And within that framework and within some other research that has gone on, one of the observations is that in order for companies to respect the rights of users, governments have to have the right frameworks in place that enable companies to respect the rights of users. And if the laws and regulations are actually forcing companies to violate the rights of users, that makes it rather difficult for companies to uphold their obligations under the UN Guiding Principles and kind of more generally their responsibilities to respect the rights of their users. I want to mention the Global Network Initiative. I see that Judith Lichtenberg, the executive director, is currently in the room. I was also involved with helping to create Global Network Initiative. Google is one of the company members. The Global Network Initiative was launched in 2008 and released a set of principles that companies should adhere to respect the rights of users in the context of government demands. And a fundamental premise of the GNI's principles and its set of operational guidelines that it developed around those principles is that there's no country on earth where governments are not asking companies to do some things that significant numbers of people feel are not consistent with internet users' rights. So it's not just, the problem of certain specific countries. Snowden really showed that this is an issue everywhere. It's a matter of degree and so on. So there was some debates that were going on, particularly a decade ago, about, should Google be in country X or country Y at all because it has these bad laws and it's doing these bad things. And within the GNI, we sort of said, look, if you tell companies you can't operate anywhere with bad laws, they won't operate anywhere. So they can't, right? So because the laws are so bad in so many places. And governments are making sort of untransparent, unaccountable demands in so many jurisdictions. And so for companies, one major piece of being responsible in an imperfect world where obviously the companies can't just change all the laws, is to be transparent with users about what is happening, about what laws it's having to comply with, about what they're being required to hand over to what governments under what circumstances. And so the transparency reporting practices that emerged certainly were very much in keeping with the operational guidelines that the GNI developed in terms of just enabling users to make their own informed decisions. So it's not that, okay, we won't go into country X because it has bad surveillance laws. So we will go into country X because we believe that people actually want our service, but we want to make sure people understand who's going to access their data from our service under what circumstances so they can decide themselves how they're going to use it. So that's kind of a fundamental aspect of transparency in a world where increasingly people are so dependent on internet and telecommunications services for so many aspects of their lives. It's a real choke point in terms of both government access to information about what citizens are doing and citizens' ability to communicate. And so if government demands upon these what we call intermediary companies, if government demands, if there's no transparency about those demands and the legal frameworks under which those demands are taking place, then basically you just have this really convenient smoke screen behind which all kinds of abuses can take place, and nobody knows what abuse is happening by whom, whether it's the company that's doing it or whether the government's doing it, or who do I hold accountable, and so on. And if you believe in an open society and accountable governance, that's not very conducive to an open society and accountable governance. And so that transparency by governments and companies about this relationship in terms of what's being taken down, what's being handed over to whom, under what circumstances, is absolutely vital to the free and open internet and to the open societies and accountable governance that needs to take place if we're going to have a free and open internet, and if the free and open internet is going to serve that aim. So just quickly to point out, just to give a shout out to a few other projects on which this working group has built. The GNI and the Center for Democracy and Technology, and Emma in particular, had developed a set of recommendations for transparency for both companies, transparency reporting in particular for both companies and governments about a year ago. That kind of helped to inform, I think, a lot of the questions and kind of research framing that took place. We have Lucy Purdon from the Institute for Human Rights and Business, who's done a lot of work on guidelines for how ICT sector companies should adhere to the UN guiding principles, and there's a transparency piece in there that's been really useful. The Open Technology Institute with Liz Woolery has been doing some work on you know, what does an ideal transparency report look like in terms of law enforcement requests and the surveillance piece. The project I'm working on is looking to benchmark companies on their disclosure and primarily their transparency around a lot of these issues. So I guess this is to say that the work of this working group, I think, is bringing together a lot of strands and building on it, and then sort of in a very internet-y way, part of a broader network of projects. And the extent to which this working group is successful, I think, will depend on the extent to which other people and projects and researchers interact with it, either build on it or critique it or work with it and so on. But this is kind of providing a platform. You'll see in the executive summary and eventually in the report that will come out, you know, questions for opportunities for further research. And this is not just, oh, this is research we're going to do. This is like, you know, these are questions that everybody in the community needs to explore and work on and try to figure out how to address. So this is, again, meant to be kind of the next layer or the next contribution to this network of research, network of accountability and transparency-related projects that are going on.
Great, thanks, Rebecca. I would add on to that, in addition to identifying specific topics for future research, one of the things we've discussed as a real need in this field is globalizing how we talk about transparency. So our consultations ended up being majority US and European governments and companies, and there are a lot of exciting initiatives coming specifically out of East Asia, from civil society, from companies, looking at better transparency reporting and other measures from governments and companies. So as we go forward, and I think for the field generally, we're really interested to talk about and look at how to improve how to globalize this conversation. Before we go on, I'd just like working group members in the room to raise your hands so everyone knows who here is a member. Great. All right, let's open it for questions.
Hi, I'm Sasha. I'm from the Netherlands. I work at Greenhost, a hosting provider. So as such, I'm, let's say, an intermediary on the internet. So I'm very interested in these topics, and I like that you've been doing a lot of research now. But I have some questions. In the Tallinn principles, it was put forward that transparency and independent, effective domestic oversight to electronic surveillance and, well, other things that should be committed to, and at the same time that the FOC members would also commit to the same things. So I find it a bit strange that in your reporting you didn't turn to, and I hope you will turn to into the future, some of the kind of like what I would consider breaches to these kind of to this kind of wordings, actually to the amount that I would call it doublespeak. And I'm talking, for instance, towards things like, well, talking about the UK, for instance, the hacking of Gemalto and Belgacom that has been published upon, where operators like me, privacies, have been breached to get to their constituents, to their customers. National security letters, a practice where I think any kind of transparency is actually lacking. And I would say, that any kind of broad blanket mass surveillance would never fit any kind of human rights framework. To get back to matching that to transparency, the only thing that we saw in transparency towards some of the things that I just mentioned is that after the, let's say, involuntary publishing of the NSA's transparency report about their practices, some people like Snowden were more or less stuck in Russia. So if the Freedom Online Coalition as a whole, and this working group in particular, but also the other working groups, want to be heard and bring something really really bring something to the table. I'm wondering what you're going to do next.
Since I have no boss to rein me in, I'm going to jump in and respond first, giving the other people with bosses to think about what they want to say. I'm so glad you said all of what you just said. You've been around, so you know that this is a multi-stakeholder working group. So, it only ends up going as far as all the different stakeholder members and their bosses can sign off on. Let's just be honest here, right? So therefore, there are certainly some stakeholders that would have liked to go farther, and other stakeholders that barely got their bosses to let them do what they're doing. But what I would say is that I would love to see, personally, I don't think it's going to come out of any of the working groups, but I would love to see, and this is where I'm saying we need a broader ecosystem of projects. I would love to see someone do regular report cards of the FOC member governments on how well they're doing. I think that would be very, very useful. I doubt it will come from one of the official working groups, but I would love to see that happen.
Yeah, I mean, this was focused on, while Tallinn was a call for all governments, it certainly was a commitment from Freedom Online Coalition members. You're absolutely right. But I mean, in the context of this work, this was looking at practice and developing best practice. It wasn't a sort of an investigation, and there are other forums for doing that, including in the UK. There's various forums and investigations that have taken place. I can't say a huge amount about the UK because we're in the middle of an election. I'm not supposed to say much at all. I may not even have a boss by the time I get back to from Mongolia. That might make life easier. So, I mean, it wasn't intended to be a sole bearing of all the Freedom Online Coalition members, but what I can say is that the commitments made in Tallinn were very genuine commitments, and it's an evolving area. We're looking at the Investigatory Powers Tribunal and the Intelligence Security Committee, all the other investigations that have happened in the UK have examined what was done, what should have been done differently, what could have been done better. And part of this is looking at that experience and trying to develop across the piece, working with companies, best practice going ahead. It's not meant to be an investigation, it's meant to be best practice guidance.
One thing I would add in terms of the work of this group to date is an interesting outcome of arranging the consultations with governments was trying to reach the right people in those governments, particularly because our focus was national security and law enforcement. And so we saw it prompt a level of internal coordination and engagement with the FOC that you wouldn't see otherwise. And because the consultations were under Chatham House rule, it was an we chose that partly in order to get to a more specific level on questions related to how national security and law enforcement hinder transparency. What does that really mean? And so in some cases, our consultations were with quite senior officials in intelligence and law enforcement agencies. Any other questions? Comments, critiques?
I can't believe Bertrand doesn't.
If not, I'll just point to some of the key themes that came up in our report, in our work to date. In this executive summary, you'll see themes as well as quick summaries of, based on how we organize our consultations, which was around understanding the state of play in terms of transparency, understanding challenges, and understanding potential opportunities that both governments and companies identified. And within that, we broke it down into legal issues, policy issues, and operational issues, which helped focus really specifically where is there Is this an issue of capacity for your government? Is this a political issue that you're dealing with? Is it a legal prohibition on disclosure for a company? In the executive summary, you'll find that as well as some of the overarching themes, which I'll just preview to spark discussion. We've already talked about the sense of just growing public expectations of both government and corporate transparency. And the representatives from companies and governments we interviewed mentioned that pretty consistently across the interviews, that they felt this pressure internally and externally to be more transparent in their activities. Another consistent theme was the need to move beyond numbers. A lot of the transparency reporting to date has focused on quantitative reporting and the number of requests made either by a government or received by a company. And one thing we heard a lot of and experienced ourselves as a group was both the need to add more context to those numbers for them to be meaningful to an audience, and also the need to provide much more information on laws, policies, the general framework under which companies and governments interact. So moving beyond numbers and what that looks like in practice was another theme that came up on both sides. Another theme that Ben mentioned was, what does it take to provide the full picture? We need more information and innovation in government reporting, as well as consistency among governments and among companies in what reporting looks like. Right now we have sort of an apples and oranges challenge in company reporting where the reports differ so much in both how they count and track requests and how they report that it's hard for an audience to really look across them and do any comparative analysis that would help inform recommendations and best practices. And the last theme I'll mention is the effective ambiguity. One thing that came up in a number of forums was what happens when a law is unclear? And the answer was usually companies err on the side of not disclosing in order to protect their employees, not run afoul of the law. We heard similar kind of mentions of ambiguity in law and policy from governments. And so one thing we've talked about going forward is identifying those areas and also looking at ways governments and companies interact, which may not be sort of formal government requests to companies as we've been discussing them, but also indirect or voluntary cooperation around requests for content restriction for user information, which are typically pretty non-transparent processes at this point. So again, sort of the effective ambiguity, where are there gaps, and how is that now hindering transparency? Yeah.
I think there are a few issues probably that don't fit within this report or maybe what you're doing, but I think they're interesting to look into. One, for example, is where, there are new technologies. I think technologists are thinking about ways, especially service providers are thinking about ways that they can't retain data. So technologies that don't allow them, for example, to see into what their users are doing or to store that data. And so I think, but there are cases where we know, right, that some governments or some agencies are requiring retention. There's some laws that are requiring retention. So I think looking into that is actually something that's interesting because I think that it's kind of like encryption, right? There's something to be said for looking at technological ways to prevent user data from being leaked, but those can be sometimes undermined then by policy. Another issue that I work on personally is sort of not for my job, but there's a independent ISP that I work with, and I think one thing that I've always felt is that community-owned infrastructure for users is actually really important, where it becomes extremely difficult not just because they have to compete with like really nice services like Google that work really well and that are available in lots of places, but I mean, another hurdle is actually this piece. So being able to comply with laws is very difficult for a small ISP because they don't have they don't have a system set up to sort of receive takedown notices or subpoenas or whatever, and so they have to deal everything with on a case-by-case basis, or employ their lawyers in every single individual situation to fight those things. So it's really difficult, right? So I think that is maybe another issue where you could look at sort of the cost to this, because we hear a lot the argument that mass surveillance, one of the antidotes is making it costly to perform, and one of the ways is through encryption. I think then another cost problem then is this sort of for smaller ISPs, and so you could actually maybe do a sort of small investigation into how that affects, because here, I mean, yeah, the sort of industry, you're working on a level, I think that for some maybe civil society organizations or whatever, they're sort of thinking locally, right, with their infrastructure, and so this misses them. What I'm trying to say. So anyway.
Great points. Thank you so much for adding those. One thing I would point you towards, the UN Special Rapporteur, David Kay, right now is working on a report that I'm really fascinated to see the outcome and think it's very critical for the kind of the future of security online, which is looking at encryption and anonymity online. So for companies, certainly we have a huge incentive to maintain our users' trust. And part of that is through providing as secure and strong communications as we possibly can. I think the issues around encryption technology and other things are going to be really frontline debates in internet freedom coming up in the next couple of years. The second point I would make regarding smaller companies and their legal process, I think that's really, really critical. The GNI provides learning forums. So GNI companies, civil society together, schedule learning forums every year where we invite outside companies and others to have these types of discussions as well, to try and share that information. I think through our annual reports and other things, I think it's an area of focus, but something we could do even more to help smaller companies deal with these legal challenges as they come in.
And just to follow up on that point, particularly in this question of, how can small and medium enterprises respond to requests? One challenge that we as the working group encountered in trying to look at the laws, policies, and practices across a whole range of governments is that it can be very difficult to even know kind of the totality of the legal framework in a particular country that could affect government, at the basic level, government ability to make requests for user data, or let alone content removal, which is kind of even harder to keep track of all of the ways government might request content restriction. And so, and that's one place where I think the kind of the best practices we were seeing emerge from the large companies that we were consulting with. A number of them made reference to, consulting with local counsel in different countries, or having staff and having experts in-house as they operated in different regions, which I think is a very good practice for any company that's big enough to be, fielding offices all over the world. But it's also not really a best practice that translates very well to a small company that is just based in one place but has a global user base. And I think that's really where we see the role of government coming in, and the obligations for government to be transparent about what the laws that they operate within actually are and how those can be applied. So that's something where I really think the framing of this working group of that kind of the relationship between governments and companies, I think really helps to surface those kinds of issues where you see even the best efforts and the best practices of companies can fall short or not really be responsive absent real action from governments as well.
Sorry about that. So I just want to actually give props to a couple of people in the Citizen Lab, Christopher Parsons and Andrew Hiltz, who have come at this topic at an entirely different way to the same end. It turns out that under Canadian law, telecommunications companies are obliged to respond to requests from citizens asking what data they collect on them, store on them, and share with governments. And so they came out with a really interesting tool called Access My Information, AMI tool is the acronym, where they automated a form letter and with the help of an advocacy group, urged Canadians to exercise their privacy rights and send in this letter. Well, it turned out that tens of thousands of Canadians did this, and it had two effects. One is it prompted many of the telcos in Canada to actually start issuing transparency reports because they were flooded with this type of request. But more importantly, it provided the first empirical data from users as to what actually the companies retain on them, what they share with governments under what conditions and so on. So there's a different way to, I don't really like this phrase, but skin a cat. And I'd just like to point that out for those who are interested to take a look at this project. We're now expanding it to do comparative research of this sort because it turns out there are countries other than Canada that have the same privacy laws, and it's a very simple tool to duplicate in different national contexts.
Bertrand?
Yeah, Bertrand Lachapelle, Director of the Internet and Jurisdiction Project. A comment piggybacking on what you were saying regarding the application of transparency to the actual legal framework that exists in the different countries. It is a major challenge to keep track of the legislations in the different countries. It is a huge burden even for the large companies. It's costly. In addition, it's duplicative because each of the large companies has to maintain the database of the existing laws. It is hard to update. And as it has been mentioned, and it's important to reiterate, it's completely out of reach for the smaller companies. Not only is it an unpleasant situation that prompts the effort of providing some kind of common reference, and within the Internet and Jurisdiction Project, one of the things that has emerged as part of the transnational regime that is being developed is precisely the idea of having a joint mutualized database that basically documents the legislations in the different countries. And we're catalyzing sort of cluster of actors that include Stanford, that includes Columbia University and other entities, including Council of Europe, to try to build a system that will update a database in a distributed manner. But the important reason why I raised the question of the smaller companies is because there is actually a link between the behavior of the small companies and the large companies. When small companies are confronted with requests that come especially on a transnational basis, like something that comes from law enforcement or country to a company that is in another country. If you're a small company, you have a very small legal team and no capacity actually to handle those requests in an appropriate and balanced manner because, let's be honest, in many cases it's a quasi-judiciary decision. And so what has been mentioned to us is usually there are two options. Either those companies stonewall, they don't answer any requests, or they cave in and they accept all requests. And in both cases, the unintended consequences are pretty damaging because if the companies cave, they become a reference point for the actors who want those requests to be accepted to go to the larger companies and say, why don't you behave like the nice ones who accept everything I ask? And if they stonewall, the reaction is different, but it's usually irritation. And after a while, either there are massive blocking of platforms or blanket regulation that applies to all. So the interesting element is that just making sure that, one, the legal framework in each of the countries is sufficiently known, and second, that there is more predictability in the criteria that can be used to answer or not answer the different requests, is not only beneficial for the small companies, but it is also indirectly beneficial for the large ones because it brings more predictability in the landscape. And this is one of the reasons why actually sharing best practices among actors is an important element. And finally, the question regarding transparency reporting, I sense, and correct me if I'm wrong, I sense a very strong desire to have a more common format for reporting, some form of, not harmonization, but standard format. This is part also of the architecture that has emerged from the discussion. And free advertisement, we have a session in this room just afterwards on this.
Any other questions or comments? Also from the other working group members, if you want to contribute anything that hasn't come up. Eric.
It's been surprising and disappointing how slow other telecom companies around the world have been to jump on the GNI board. What's your feeling in terms of why that is and whether there's anything we can do? Is it because nobody cares?
I think we should almost point to Judith Lichtenberg, who's in the back, who is working very diligently with a group of telcos called their Telecom Industry Dialogue, working very closely to see if there's any alignment between GNI and the ID. But maybe perhaps for a different conversation. I think from GNI's just as one single member of GNI, there have been a lot of conversations lately trying to push some of the synergies from these two different industries that have similar issues together on some of these things. It's a challenge, of course, but those conversations are very much ongoing.
We're also eager to hear if, as we've been discussing a little, if there are other initiatives in the field that you think are complementary, that we could work with, build on, contribute to. We have sort of a list already internally, and as Rebecca said, that we've built on to date, but we're really eager to use this opportunity to scope out others as well.
I could make a comment. Yeah, actually speaking a little bit to Eric's question a little tangentially, I think one of the interesting things that has come from this research is that there have been conversations with lots of different companies, including a number of telcos, about why they do or do not produce transparency reports and kind of what their thinking is. And from my own work as well, I found that a lot of companies, are approaching these issues very differently and don't have a lot of comparative information about what other companies are doing or what's working and what's not working, or kind of what best practice might look like, and internally as well as externally. So I think, the GNI plays a really important role in helping to facilitate those conversations among companies and with stakeholders. And I think this research has also help to do that. I think more externally, perhaps one of the problems, again, speaking bluntly, for why we haven't seen more companies joining GNI or telcos or others is there hasn't been enough stakeholder pressure on them. And in part that is that there's not enough kind of clear information about how different companies' practices and policies compare with one another. And so, I'm involved with a project that's trying to kind of shine a bit more of a public light on that and kind of look at what the benchmark is. And that might kind of help companies to sort of move in the directions of being more comfortable with certain types of practices and in joining stakeholder initiatives. And, I think part of the problem with some companies has been they're afraid that if they join something, it'll draw a target on their back. I think similarly to, with Freedom Online Coalition, like if a government joins Freedom Online Coalition, then everybody's like, why aren't you living up to the commitments of the Freedom Online Coalition? And so similarly, if a company doesn't join GNI, nobody's asking it, why you're not doing everything perfectly the way you should. You're just kind of over there. Whereas if you join, then you've got more scrutiny on you, which, I think the GNI members would argue, actually, that spotlight is good because it helps you build credibility with your stakeholders and with your users, and it's in the long run better for your business. But in the short run, it involves a lot of risk that particularly for older companies that tend to have more risk-averse management structures, it can be quite scary.
And actually, one of the findings in the consultations that we did was that for the companies we talked to who were doing transparency reports, there was a very strong executive level commitment to the idea that transparency is a value of the company, and that transparency served to further the values and goals of the company. And so I think there was also then relatedly, we noticed that different companies had very different audiences in mind at times for who they were producing their transparency reports for. They knew they were making them public and kind of a general public information document, but some were looking at investors as actually the people they were hearing from the most about wanting to know the answers to questions about access to user data and content restriction. Others were clearly responding to direct demands they'd gotten from users and direct questions they'd had from their own user base about the privacy and security of their information. Others really pointed out that the press was often the people who seem to read the transparency reports the closest, and then a lot of recognition that advocacy organizations and NGOs were a clear kind of target audience. So I think it's in thinking about why don't more companies do this sort of thing or join initiatives along these lines. I think understanding those, what might the particular audience for a particular company be, and are they getting that pressure and that pressure, particularly at the top levels of the organization, as this is something that some constituency really wants to see from that particular company.
Yes. To the extent that we are digressing a bit into why telcos are not cooperating, just wanted to give my 2 cents on it. Telcos usually started out as state monopolies, and telcos in each country have enjoy relatively stable market shares in respective countries. It's not like internet companies where MySpace can be phased out by Facebook in a couple of years. Yahoo can be phased out in terms of search engines, within a few years by Google, things like that. When telcos don't cooperate, the people in those countries, telcos in one country do not cooperate. People in that country have nowhere else to go. There is no other company that's more responsive to consumer demand and consumer privacy. If I'm asked to give an advice to the governments, I think that there is an antitrust aspect to all of this. For instance, in Korea, 3 companies cover 99% of the market share, 3 telcos, in terms of mobile communication. And because of a small number, they are very conducive to group behavior, parallel behavior. So if one doesn't issue transparency report, the other 2 will not. If one doesn't respond to user's request for information on whether his information has been turned over to the police or not, the other will not. So the government should be doing more antitrust policing on that types of parallel behavior, and maybe to go beyond that and think about the market shares themselves. I know that it's not as bad in Korea, where one company has 50% of the market share, but those market shares really entrench those companies into the current state of non-cooperation with GNI or any other initiatives. So, and I bet there is a proportionality between that, that market structure and the level of non-responsiveness to these progressive initiatives.
Yeah, hi, Sarah McKeown from Citizen Lab. I just have a couple of questions. First, to what extent is the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights useful in this? It seems like they started out with a lot of promise and potential, but it seems like they've gone in directions that may not be directly relevant to the topics that we're most interested in. Are there any plans to try to get any traction there? And then secondly, the issue of transparency when it comes to spyware, and even perhaps extending it to dual-use technology in general. I note that the FOC members call upon governments worldwide to promote transparency and independent, effective domestic oversight related to electronic surveillance. And so far the discussion has focused quite a bit on ICT companies that deal with user data, but what about the possibilities for tackling the spyware industry? I think there's probably somewhat of a sense of resignation that because they have such close ties to the security state that there's not going to be much headway. But I think the pendulum is swinging on that, and there's a lot of movement now towards more effective oversight and reporting related to spyware. So is it a possibility that the working group might be able to tackle that issue in the next phase?
Well, maybe my question will piggyback on hers. I mean, to the extent that now we are talking about the scope of the working group. So far, I read the executive summary. The working group is supposed to work on privacy and transparency, but right now it's more about transparency. It's more about being transparent about infringement of privacy or restriction on privacy done by the government and the companies. But when we talk about privacy, we should talk about whether the information should have been turned over to begin with, right? Not just being transparent about whether the information has been turned over. So I guess my first question is whether the working group will move into that area, and if the working group is, there's one specific topic that I think the FOC should tackle, which is warrantless access to user identification data. In Canada, the Canadian Supreme Court decided in the Spencer decision that making available user identification data without warrant to the police is unconstitutional. Marcos Civil has a specific provision that user identification data cannot be accessed without judicial approval. But against these new developments, the US law, UK, Germany, France, all their laws allow warrantless access to user identification data, including Korea. And I think it is one state of the law that's really being completely ignored by the governments. And I think that this warrantless access to the user identification data are really important especially in the age of mass surveillance, because it facilitates mass surveillance by a great deal. A lot of mass surveillance is about communication metadata without really identity data attached. But the moral obstacle or the moral scruple in aggregating that communication metadata is really lowered because these are anonymous data. But then again, they turn around and then they have a law that allow the police to connect these anonymous data to the real people. So it creates this I mean, it gives the investigative authorities false impression that what they are getting is not really privacy infringing. So I'm hoping that at some point FOC will move into that topic.
One thing I'd note that these are all great ideas that we're sort of taking in. One thing in terms of parts of our research that aren't reflected in the executive summary in its abbreviated form, a lot of the questions in the report, in our consultations, were about sort of the actual policies around this issue, not just the tactics to be transparent about them. And we haven't summarized that first section in the executive summary as it is now, but it was part of the scope of the conversations. Do we know how much? Bertrand?
Yeah, one point I wanted to highlight is the distinction between the ISPs and the internet platforms. In most cases, the ISPs, and particularly the mobile operators, in order to be able to operate in the country, have to get a license. And on the occasion of getting the license, of course, there are conditions regarding how to access or not to access. By definition, they have foot on the ground, which means that they are strongly under the law of the country where they are operating, which makes it much harder or much less leeway on acceptance or non-acceptance. Comparatively, depending on the age of the different companies, but also on their practices, internet companies have or not foot on the ground. They don't need a license. So they are remote from a lot of the jurisdictions that may send requests for content takedown or access to user data, which brings them a lot of leeway in the appreciation according to their terms of service or their evaluation of what is the quality of the due process in the country in question. The challenge is that in that regard, there are no criteria that are sufficiently agreed at the moment, because in most cases, we're dealing with issues that are not under the system of dual incrimination, like the mutual legal assistance treaty. Like something can be illegal in one country and not illegal in another one, and just because a country asks for the identification or asks for the takedown of a content, it doesn't mean that it is enforceable in the other country, which puts a huge burden actually on the companies in making the decisions in each case. And this difference between the ISPs, who basically have to answer and accept almost any request that is being put to them at the national basis by the national government, and the companies, needs to be taken into account also because there are no clear avenues of recourse in the whole process. If you have a request that is made to a company in a country by the government of that country, there is the normal avenues of recourse pending the confidentiality and non-disclosure. But on a transport national basis, which is one of the major challenges that we're confronted with, we do not have the set of criteria that allow, for instance, to decide when and whether particular information should be communicated or not, knowing that there is also a question of tiers between the identification, the metadata, and the actual content. And I know everybody is following with great attention the case in the court in New York with Microsoft and the Irish and the email stored in the Irish data center. But when I look at the reaction that people have on the one decision that the European Court of Justice did on the right to be de-indexed, that I purposefully not called the right to be forgotten, which is a wrong misnomer, the impact that the one single decision that will be made in the US on the Microsoft case regarding what is the rule that is applicable to the different conditions of access to data means that I know a lot of amicus briefs have been made around that case, But this is an element that needs to be framed. Finding the criteria for transnational communication of data, we're confronted not only with the diversity of legislations, but the conflict of legislation, because the interpretation of ECPA in the US may prevent some of the things that countries legitimately require. So international arrangements on this is far from being on the horizon, and just documenting this problem is probably a good thing that the working group could do, let alone solve it.
I'm with the Hong Kong Transparency Report, and I want to mention, make a quick comment on the opportunities from the Government Transparency Report perspective. We've been tracking and analyzing the Hong Kong government's release of data since 2013, and we have been working with the local legislators to encourage the governments to release more detailed data each year, and we found that the government is actually quite cooperative towards our requests. I think the difficulty they have is they don't know how to what they are supposed to be reporting. So, for instance, in 2013, the government just released the number of requests and the number of the requests the service providers acceded to, the reasons. But now they have started, certain government departments have released the names of the service providers they send the request to, the nature of the request, whether they were metadata or content. And gradually the government clarified the legal procedures they need to go through to request such data. So we see great promises from the government side to release such data. Also, just a quick remark from the small service providers. For instance, the small online forums in Hong Kong, they have their own sort of transparency reports. For instance, they just released on their website like how many requests they received from the government on a not regular basis. But I see it as a positive progress from the small websites perspective. Thank you.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to learn from your project and others, as we've discussed, that are civil society-led initiatives to clarify what government reporting might look like and might be useful, and working with governments to figure out the bounds of transparency and how to communicate that meaningfully. I think we're out of time. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming, and please continue to give us ideas over the course of the conference, and we're also talking about how to set up a mechanism to have more public input onto the group as ideas come to you, as you're interested in getting involved in the coming weeks.